So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Pedro Enrique Puentes. I am a second-year history PhD student. I just want to say thank you for coming today to this wonderful conversation that we will have. I also want to thank the organizing committee for letting me be part of the committee as well. And thank you for all of you being here. We really appreciate you all. If you've never been to What Matters to Me and Why, I think this is a very wonderful series. If you never had the opportunity to come, fun fact, this is actually my first time in person, even though I am on the committee, but it is my first time being here in person. All the other ones I've been via Zoom or YouTube recorded, but I'm very thankful to be here, and it's such a nice place to be. So many beautiful and wonderful faces being here with us. So yes, if you could take a minute or a quick second to introduce yourself to someone next to you, say hi, so we could get things going, and I will pass it over to my colleague Claire. Thank you.
Okay, so just to, does this work? So just to echo my colleague Pedro, welcome. This is a series where we ask faculty and staff to sort of not give a professional talk, but sort of tell us what makes them tick, what really matters to them, and wherever that may take them. And we've had some fascinating talks in the past, which you're welcome to look at. Most all of them are posted online. Those in person are promised a free lunch, which you will receive at the end of the talk. So today it's a pleasure to welcome my colleague Franklin Dollar. My name, by the way, is Clare Yu. I am a professor of physics and astronomy, and Franklin is my colleague. He is an enrolled member of the Dry Creek Band of Pomo Indians, and I think he's the first Native American speaker we've had in this series. He's also the Associate Dean of Graduate Studies at UCI in the School of Physical Sciences. He earned his bachelor's in engineering physics from Berkeley, and then went on to receive a master's and his doctorate in applied physics from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. He's an associate professor in the Department of Physics and Astronomy, and there he researches intense light-matter interactions and their applications towards high-energy density science, and in particular he studies ultra-fast lasers and their interactions with plasmas, and that results in the generation of X-rays. He's published over 80 publications and proceedings, and has served on numerous committees, including the Department of Energy's LaserNet U.S. Scientific Advisory Board, the Fusion Energy Science Advisory Committee, and the Executive Steering Committee for the UC Leadership and Excellence through Advanced Degrees Program. Did this just die? Okay. He is a Kavli Fellow, a Sloan Research Fellow, and a Fellow of the American Physical Society. He is an awardee of the NSF Career Award, the Tom Angel Faculty Mentorship Award, and the American Indian Science and Engineering Society's Most Promising Scientist Award. So without further ado, let me welcome Franklin to the podium.
Great, thank you everyone. So thanks everyone for showing up today to hear me talk about what matters to me and why. Thank you, Claire, for the great introduction. And so the first part of the question of what matters to me is pretty straightforward. People matter to me, so that's pretty easy. The second part of the question is the why, is much more nuanced, complicated question that'll take me the rest of my time here to try to unpack and give kind of a bit of a perspective of. To help me better explain it, I'm going to use the context of my own lived experiences first, before talking a little bit about my path and some of the people who are important in my life to get me to where I am today, and why all of it ties together. So, I am a California native, not only in the sense that I was born here, but also in the sense that my dad was born here, and his dad was born here, and his dad was born here, and his dad. And you can go back many thousands of years, and I can still make that statement. As mentioned, I'm an enrolled member of the Dry Creek Band of Pomo Indians. We're a small sovereign nation, about an hour and a half north of San Francisco on the 101, right around where the wine country meets the redwoods. So very, very beautiful area. And what makes it slightly awkward, though, is that even today, walking around, if I tell people I'm American Indian, it's a very awkward experience. And it's not just awkward here, it's awkward anywhere in the United States. People are really confused on what it even means to be American Indian. People are really confused on, do I say Native American? Am I allowed to? Do I use American Indian instead? Is it indigenous? Is that the right phrase? And I find this all slightly hilarious because, none of us used that phrasing before colonial times, and certainly now it wasn't like we were consulted when new names come out. So it's a very, very interesting thing that this whole endeavor of what do we even call each other that seems to fixate a lot of people in society is caused by that very societal history, which is, of course, a theme in American Indian history. It's also very awkward since we basically have absolutely no education on American Indian history or American Indian culture in the United States. People that I talk to don't understand that the 14th Amendment doesn't apply to American Indians, or that Obamacare has exceptions for American Indians, or why those might be the cases. People think we don't pay taxes, or that we go to college and it's free. I could very much assure you both of those things are not true. I can show my Mohela statements to the contrary of that. And because we have this singular name of American Indians, people think we have a homogeneous identity. We don't make that mistake with Europeans. We very much know that if I confused calling a British person and a French person, there would be consequences to pay. But we don't think of the same thing for saying, if someone's Lakota or Sioux or something like that. And we all have this kind of, picture in our heads that everyone kind of lives in a teepee, or that they sustain themselves on buffalo or other things, despite the fact that it's very, very geographical and culturally dependent on where the tribe was in the United States, or that some of these tribes don't exist where they used to. For instance, my own tribe originally had its ancestral land in an area that is not where our reservation is today. About 100 years ago, a resort was built, and they put up a dam so there'd be a place to go swimming in, and that whole area was flooded and hundreds of homes were lost. And now we were relocated to another area. And people don't know that type of history. People don't know the names of the land that they inhabit or the names of the people who used to inhabit there. And to be fair, I didn't learn any of this from my classes. I learned a lot of my own history from things like recordings of my great-grandmother or transcripts of conversations she had. Because when I was in grade school here in California, I didn't learn about American Indian history. I learned things like, what the El Camino Real was. And I built many fantastic dioramas of missions because as far as I could tell from my history books, that's where history started. Even this institution right here, right? We talk about UCI, and colloquially we'll see lots of people laud the land grant system, or talk about how UCI started by a $1 purchase of 1,000 acres of land, when we conveniently forget how that 1,000 acres came to be in a wealthy landowner's pocket. And even today, in terms of Native American History Month, we'll show a nice photo 50 years ago of someone surveying the land at Irvine, getting ready to build the campus. And if you look in the background of this photo, there's an Accochement woman and her child just walking across the land, confused about what's going on around them. Because this isn't ancient history for a lot of people in California. This is their current existence. A lot of people forget that there are still millions of American Indians that live in the United States today. The other awkward thing, of course, that happens when I tell people that I'm American Indian is that my mom is Italian. And it turns out Italian genes are extremely dominant. So my skin is much more pale than my father's skin. I'm very much white passing. If I go into a room that's based on diversity, I'm very ethnically ambiguous, and nobody sees my identity that lies beneath my skin. So I have this kind of identity that stays inside of me, and I can go out professionally and no one sees that. And in some cases, particularly in the United States, that's an amazing thing. When I would go to stores with my parents as a kid, security would always follow my father as we walked around the store. They let me go into stores like Nordstrom today, and I don't have a similar issue. It also means that, unlike my father, I do have to shave a lot. And so I came from a reservation, and of course, we have no history or training on what it means to be in the American Indian experience, so people don't know what that even entails. And for context, I mentioned that we were relocated because a resort was built, and so we ended up on a 75-acre parcel in Alexander Valley in Sonoma County. In Alexander Valley, one of the most lush, rich areas in California. Some of the best wines in the state come from there. And almost all of it is extremely fertile land to grow whatever you want, except for the 75-acre chunk of steep, hilly rock. And that's where we ended up. And this is very similar to a lot of other tribes that had a similar situation where they ended up with land that was far away from people, very rural, and you can't farm on it because if you could farm, that land would be valuable. And so land that was perceived to be useless made fine reservation land. And in California, we're very concerned about giving away land that might have gold on it, so there's much smaller, more scattered reservations, and we didn't push multiple tribes into the same area. So this is one of the reasons why we have over 100 tribes in California, recognized tribes, whereas in other states you might have only 2 or 3 because they were all pushed into one area and we just called them all the same thing. And so we were relocated to this parcel, and there is no economy. Because the land is technically owned by the federal government in trust, we can't do things like get loans to go build houses on there. We can't do any kind of economic development, and for a long, long time, there really wasn't a way to establish any kind of generational wealth, right? A lot of the housing that's there is manufactured housing. The trailer that I lived in when I lived on the reservation actually can't even be sold in California due to state code. However, the state code doesn't apply on the reservation land, so we were able to buy it very cheap and live on it there. So you have a history of not being able to generate wealth, not being able to have jobs because you're so rural and there's no economy, and the only way to eat because you can't grow any food is to get sustenance from the United States government. And so this builds up, this kind of destroys the sovereignty of the tribe and sets up this long situation of being dependent on the government. And I myself grew up receiving these commodity foods from the United States government, and that program continues on today. So the other thing that I want to talk about, though, is, so that existence was rough. It may not be too surprising that we didn't have electricity for a long period till I was about a junior in high school. We were able to afford getting a telephone pole installed so we can run a wire. There was a well and a storage tank of water. We had a hose that connected us, but it would break a lot, so most of the time we'd have water just from filling jugs and taking it over to the storage tank. And in the summer, those tanks and wells would dry up, so we'd have to truck water in that the tribe would pay for. And that was kind of our existence in the 1990s, 1980s, and in early 2000s. And again, we're in one of the most wealthy areas of California. When I first filled out my FAFSA in high school, our family income was something like less than $15,000. And that is all a bunch of things that are just like facts. Now I'm going to provide a little bit of context for this, because one thing, I do make it a point that whenever I give presentations, whether they're professional, outreach, education, whatever the case may be, I do a bit of introduction and I talk about the fact that I come from a reservation. The thing that I don't normally talk about is what happened before I moved to the reservation. So I moved to the reservation in middle school. Before that, well, it's a little interesting story. So my parents battled with heroin addiction, and as such, my father ended up spending a fair amount of time with drug felonies and ending up in prison. So in fact, like when I was born, he was in prison. And at the time I was born, I lived with my grandparents in Santa Clara, and in about 3rd grade was kind of the first time we'd find ourselves homeless. and we would be homeless on and off for the next few years up until middle school when we'd moved to the reservation. And we would move all around California, and there were lots of struggles with this. My older brother ended up running away and then finally joining the military. My father would end up in prison a couple more times. When we didn't have housing, we'd go ahead and stay in things like parks. So like I very much enjoyed beaches. Clam Beach was a particular favorite, but also things like shelters or local churches and food pantries would be able to provide some support of some kind. And our grandparents, whenever they could muster enough money, would try to get us into an apartment, but that never really lasted very long. This changed when my grandparents passed, and then we found ourselves without any support at all. At the time, we didn't live, but we were in an area very close to the reservation, and it ended up that there was a plot that was available that we were able to move to. And even though I just described the reservation as this very impoverished place, for me it was this haven, because it was stability. It was a home. I was near family. I could go over to cousins or aunties' houses and just talk with them, have coffee, have an existence that didn't make me feel like I had to run from one place to the next. And it was a home, and it was a community, and it was something that meant a lot to me. Because although we had all of these generational issues of being impoverished and not having many opportunities, we had something that I wasn't able to find before. And that community really made me feel part of something larger than myself. And so I found myself very active in tribal events, whether it was just going and helping my aunt cook torts, or going and participating in helping clean up the venues for tribal meetings or for big times or other tribal events. Everyone I saw there would come and have a task to play, and they'd all work hard to make all the events work out. And that was something that meant a lot to me. So that is kind of the first stage of my life where things made sense, and I was very happy with where I was at. And now I'm going to leave all that behind and go to my educational journey. So for the rest of my childhood, I was okay. I was on the reservation, and I didn't move around anymore. After that, I would end up going from my local high school, which was a public California high school. We had the largest graduating class of 38 students. And I'd go to UC Berkeley. And so that's an interesting jump. And so, and now I'm some associate dean at the University of California. So that's amazing. And so I get a question a lot of like, how in the world did that happen, right? Statistically, you don't have people that have, some of the history that I talk about, you just don't see them in positions like this. So how in the world did we make that jump? And that's where I go back to people. And so what I'm going to talk about next is really a story of people. In high school, I had no context for what it meant to have a career or a job or a degree or any of that. College sounded like something that was really expensive, and I really didn't know what it even meant to go do something like that. My mom did some community college, my dad had an associate's, but beyond that, I didn't know anyone who had a white collar or a blue collar job or even what those phrases meant. What I did know is that I worked at the local drugstore chain, Long's Drugs, for anyone who's been in California a while. And I knew the manager there made something like $65,000 a year, and that was an obscene amount of money to me at the time. And I was like, that seems pretty good. I should just do that. I work here. I do a good job here. I should go do that. And thankfully, I had some very supportive high school teachers that kind of showed me that there was other things out there. And so the first person I'm going to talk about is Brad Goodhart. And so Mr. Goodhart was my high school science teacher. And he helped me become more involved in science, and in particular physics. Again, this is a very small school, very small classes, so we did get to know each other pretty well. And he had this kind of project that I could work on, and a college-level physics textbook that I could read out of, and he made it to where I could take an AP physics class where we never had an AP physics class. It was a class of one, it was just me, and I was able to do it. I didn't do very well, but I was able to work through a lot of the physics early on. But that wasn't even the real value of the experience. The real value in the experience was learning who Brad Goodhart was. Because he lived out there and he taught at this high school, but that wasn't his passion. Well, it was his passion, but it wasn't his primary job. His primary job was going to Africa and giving nature tours. And he'd go ahead and record animals out in the wildlife and use them to make documentaries. He discovered animals and insects that hadn't been seen before. And he used a lot of the resources there to help support the people in that area. And so he would end up supporting the African Orphans Foundation, which supports African orphan girls in a variety of countries in Africa. He ended up being on the board there, and a lot of the work he did was to divert resources and attention to this cause. And so this tall white guy in California was able to spend a lot of his time and effort making a difference on the other side of the planet. And the impactful thing for me was this was just like a teacher in my high school, and yet he was making change that was global. And it showed me that even in our little tiny chunk of rural California, how accessible change can actually be. And that was a very important lesson for me to learn early on. He also convinced me that I should consider this school called Berkeley, and that it might be a good thing for me to entertain. Because at the time, I didn't want to go to a place where I didn't know anyone and be straddled with huge amounts of debt. That seemed like an awful idea. But he talked me into it, and he was right. Eventually, because my first year at UC Berkeley was quite miserable. I went from my class of 38 to something like a class of 500 for intro chemistry, and it was more people than were enrolled in my whole school district combined. And it was a very, very difficult experience for me to transition into. By the end of my first year there, I had a GPA of 1.8. I failed my first physics class, which wasn't a promising start for someone in the major of engineering physics, and I was absolutely convinced that I didn't belong there and I should leave. And I likely would have, if not for the intervention of two people. The first person I'm going to talk about is a program that UC Berkeley used to have called the Multicultural Engineering Program, and it was run by Dr. Michelle Descoutures. She was the first African-American Rhodes Scholar from Berkeley, and she ran this program. She ran a lot of programs built around the diverse student experience at Berkeley. And those programs were great and very helpful, but for me, the real value in it was establishing this community of people in the engineering school. And so in particular, there was the Hispanic Engineers and Scientists, the Black Engineers, Science and Student Association, and seeing these groups run and operate really helped me find people to study with, get involved in kind of larger group activities. And then I was recruited to go ahead and restart the American Indian Science and Engineering Society because there wasn't one. There were no students to be involved in it then. And having Michelle's support and having her push me and think that I could step into these leadership roles was very important. And she helped me with a mantra that she would tell me all the time, that this is hard. Engineering is hard. Science is hard. You can do this. And just having someone just tell you you can do this when student affairs advisors or other faculty advisors in the university are very much telling me that I should consider other options and leave the program, having at least one person in there being like, I understand this program, I understand your pain, but you can do this. It was a huge difference in my career. The other person who kept me from leaving is Bridget Nacconi. She was an admissions officer at Berkeley, and so technically her job is recruiting, not retention, but just by virtue of her position, she ended up being a sort of matriarch for the American Indian community at Berkeley. And she found me kind of struggling on my own and helped introduce me to the other Native students on campus, which ended up being kind of like the family on campus that I didn't know I could have. We were all from different tribes, and we all had very different experiences. Turns out being from a 75-acre reservation as opposed to being one that's larger than the state of Delaware, you have very different lived experiences. But we all had kind of similar experiences to coming to a place that didn't seem to acknowledge your existence, having that invisibility. And that was something that pulled us together. And we all seemed to have a lot of the same kind of struggles and a lot of the same perspectives on things. And so it was a very nice family to have. It wasn't a very large group. The group that I was in was between 10 and 20 students, depending on the year. But it was very, very critical for me knowing that I had a home there when I couldn't be around family. Probably most importantly, though, that it showed me that my history, my ancestors, and that experience was important in something worth being celebrated. So I didn't drop out, but I was still a very far away from being a successful student. And I was still working at Long's drugstore. I had transferred to the store in Berkeley, which was its own interesting experience. And I would continue to work there, working Friday, Saturday, Sunday, trying to pay the way through, until I found a session for an event on campus run by Diana Lizarraga. She ran the UC Leads program on campus at the time. Now she runs a huge number of programs. And at the time, I still didn't really understand what people did with the degrees they get, let alone a degree called engineering physics. And so I didn't understand what was going to happen with a career. And I did work a lot through college, but I was working, slightly above minimum wage. And so I still had lots of bills to pay. I still had need to eat. And finding out that there was this info session where they had free dinner, free pizza, I was very excited to go there and get the free pizza. And I was absolutely floored when I found out that it was a program that would give me money to go work in a lab, and that would pay considerably more than my job at the drugstore. I literally couldn't understand how this was something that was possible and that I never heard about it. And research still at that point was this very abstract thing. Because at that point, all I knew about physics labs is what I learned in my class. And if you haven't taken intro physics, the first physics lab you take a ball and you put it on a ramp and it rolls down the ramp. And you have some 1980s stopwatch and you click it to measure how fast the ball rolls down the ramp, and then you go, gravity works. And so it is very not that's what I thought a physics lab was. And it turns out that is not at all what a physicist actually does when they work in research. And so seeing that there was this opportunity for this, I interviewed for the position, very much not the student that they normally go for. I had this garbage GPA. I really didn't even know what I wanted to do, but I knew I wanted to do something. I wanted to get out there and try something. And Diana saw this kind of passion underneath this incoherent mess of not knowing what to do and the background that I had, and she gave me a shot and allowed me to start in this program, which really did set me on the path for where I am today. And one of the most important things that happened is she introduced me to David Atwood, who was a professor in electrical engineering, and he worked up at Lawrence Berkeley National Labs and had a new NSF center that needed some students to go work in it. And so I was able to go up and work at this national lab at a giant particle accelerator. And this is when I first saw a physics lab, and it still floored me to this. It's a really, really impressive facility. They film Marvel movies there. It's like that's the picture you should have in your head when you think of this. And I just walked in, I was like, this place is amazing. And they're like, yeah, you'll be sitting there, and you'll be controlling the X-ray beams that come out of the particle accelerator there when it hits these crystals, and it's just like, it's still ridiculous to even talk about using words. And they'd pay me for this, and it paid so much more than the working at the drugstore. And this was just really an incredible experience for me. But that wasn't the value of it. These expensive machines, the science that was happening, the real value of it came from working with the graduate students there. Because the graduate students were really the lifeblood of everything that was happening around. And they were students. I felt comfortable just asking questions about why everything happened. And then this really amazing thing happened because, if you look at the equations that govern electrodynamics, it kind of looks like you dropped a scientific calculator and it hit the keys you never use at the top. It's really messy and ugly, and there's vectors, and nobody likes vectors. And suddenly, I was sitting here with a machine that took charged particles and waved them around and controlled them. And all of these equations had context, and they made sense. And I could ask questions, we could have discussions about what it all meant. And suddenly, these equations had meaning. And then the math made sense. And so whereas I had a very, very bad time with lower division electrodynamics, I had a very, very easy time. Well, I ended up getting an A in upper division electrodynamics. And it made me feel like I could be part of this graduate student cohort. And that sense of belonging really made me feel like this is something that I would be able to do. From there, I'd go to University of Michigan. My thesis advisor, Karl Krashelnik, recruited me into the lab to work on high-intensity lasers, which I still work on today. The real interesting thing with that is that he had moved from Imperial College in London. And his group, his prior group over there, had something that I had not yet seen in physics groups in the United States, and that was gender diversity. In physics in the United States, we struggle to get above something like 30% female involvement, right? We never see the degrees go above that really. And in fact, in many programs, they could be much worse. And yet, here we had this case of someone who came from across the seas, and their group had as many women as men. And then we met with other European groups, and they were also very similar in that. And then I learned that in some countries, like Spain and Italy, there's more female physicists than male. And I started to understand that these ideas of what existed in the United States were not these global constructs. They were things that we have that nobody else has, and that they don't have to be that way. Similarly, in the applied physics cohort, smaller cohort, 7 to 10 students a year, but they also were extremely diverse. And it was founded by someone who had come over from Europe, didn't know the university system very well, and did a novel way of looking at students, gauging them, bringing them in. And it's a very successful program, and students do very well. I might be a little biased in that statement. But even while I was there, the United States produces on average about 1 American Indian physicist every year. Actually less than 1. And while I was in that program, there was 1 more while I was in the program. So that kind of shows a little bit of the work that they do, trying to buck some of these trends that maybe we take for granted in the United States. The last person I have time to talk about today is my thesis advisor, Margaret Mernon. Incredibly well-known name in our field, won basically every award you can think of, from MacArthur Fellowships to Isaac Newton medals. And she trained me on how to be a faculty. And put me in the position where I could supervise graduate students, introduce me to program managers so I could learn how grants work, serving on review committees, this kind of thing. But she also showed me that you can have excellence in outreach and teaching while also having excellence in research. And in fact, they can facilitate each other so all of them become better. The rising tide can lift all ships. And this was a philosophy that I really took to heart. Since then, I ended up here. And in a twist of fate, I was assigned to teach that very same physics class that I failed in my first year of undergrad. And so, trying to be diligent, I went through and I wanted to know how I could be a really good teacher to make sure I make this class everything, because I was really scared of just messing up the whole class since I failed it that first time. And so I opened literature, and I read reports, and I visited different workshops, and I found out that we are actually absolutely, horribly, miserably awful at teaching physics in the United States. Having 50-50 pass-fail rates are kind of things that we've just kind of accepted. The average GPAs across the UC system hover around 2.5-ish for our intro physics courses, and that mirrors what we see nationally. And we know this. The first major physics education results came out in the late 80s. And since then, it's been consistently showing that people don't take a lot out of the classes, that people have a poor experience, that we have a lot of content in there, but people aren't taking away the learning outcomes that we want. And so seeing all of this out here made me kind of understand that I internalized that first year experience as my own deficiencies. My own inferiorities of not being good enough to be in this program, not being good enough or smart enough to take this class. When in reality, this class wasn't ever about trying to take someone from that came with a background like mine and giving me the education that I not only needed but was paying for. And so now I can kind of return to this question of how did I make it through? There's a lot of students that are in situations like mine that don't get that chance, that have different life experiences that prevent them from meeting the people who can help them. I find myself in a very fortunate position of having everyone that I mentioned today, and of course I didn't even get to mention a lot of the other people along the path too, so apologies if anyone's listening, I didn't say your name, because you do still mean a lot to me. And I looked at myself previously as I'm so lucky to have met these people, when in reality what I did was I had a network. And networking is something that all of us in this room know are very, very important, but a lot of us come in with no network. let alone that we need one to survive and succeed, and that we can lean on such a network to help us when times get tough. And so we also come from an experience where we experience a large amount of disenfranchisement. We don't feel entitled to the resources that we are paying for. And so we can end up with a much, much worse experience at the same institution. And so a lot of us don't make it through. A lot of us can also look at the system of higher education and see it as a system that's just not meant for them. Either they're not good enough, they're not smart enough, or the system just isn't going to do anything to help them succeed. And what I see now is that even this idea that there is a system is somewhat flawed. We are at a University of California. In the University of California, Fiat Lux, all of these things, we're in this building. It's made of drywall and rebar and concrete and whatnot. And it's not something that's immutable. Right? All of the rules of how this institution exists, we came up with. The thing that makes it what it is all the people that are involved, all the people that are here in the decisions that they make. That's the real power. And anyone can step in and be part of that and contribute to that to make the world into a better vision of itself. So now I can finally complete the question that I was tasked with for today of what matters to me and why. People matter to me. And the people that mattered to me throughout my experience matter because they had no obligation to spend any time with me. They had no obligation to go out of their way, spending extra time to make sure I had not even a guarantee of success, but just a chance of success, just a chance for a better opportunity. And thankfully they did and step in so that I can be here where I am today. And I'm extremely fortunate to have known these people, but now it's my turn to be in this situation. My turn to take whatever position of privilege that I've been honored to serve as and use that as a tool to help others come through and use it as a way to try to change whatever system that I am in, to be better accommodating, to be more inclusive and allow more opportunities for those that really want to come in and do the same thing that we all come here to do, which is to make the world a better place. So if I can just step in and take some of these students who statistically we don't see here, and help them understand that they too can have a path to be here, and just maybe we haven't come up with that path yet, then I have done my job. And so that's what matters to me and why. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for an excellent talk. And so we're now going to open it up for questions. You can ask questions on Zoom by raising your hand, or the audience here. We welcome questions as well. And so let me just start out by asking you a couple of questions that came. Do you still have connections, relations with the reservation and your tribe up in?
Yeah. So my tribe is in Northern California. It's close to Santa Rosa. We actually have direct flights there from this airport. And so pre-COVID, I used to go up to tribal meetings and whatnot. Post-COVID, it's been a little more difficult. And so I do, even though the interesting thing is California is a really, really big state. So getting there is still somewhat difficult. And in fact, my wife's Navajo, and Navajo Nation starts just a little bit east of Flagstaff. And it's faster for us to drive there than it is for us to drive back to my rancheria. So I actually spend more time now in the Navajo Nation than I do back in my home.
I guess my other question was, you said you researched your teaching freshman physics.
Yes.
How did that turn out?
I found that, so one of the pieces of advice that people give new faculty is that teaching can fill a vacuum. So however much time you give towards it is how much time it will take. That is absolutely true. Now I think I understand that that's true for anything you don't know how to do. And so first year grad students, it's like, go do this. They can spend 30 hours reading papers. They could spend all of this time because it's the first time they're doing something like research and they don't have the idea of how to start. And so similarly, I found myself spending a lot of time, but what ended up being the most productive would be these workshops. You have these new physics faculty trainings that the American Association of Physics Teachers puts on. Those were very, very useful. I also am fortunate enough to know a lot of physics education researchers who can give me some great advice and some of the best techniques that they have. Even in light of all of that, you still, for a lot of this, you only know by doing. And so you teach the class, and now you have a lot of insight that you didn't have before, and you can iterate and make the course better. So I don't think I've ever taught an intro class that's been the same, but I do think that every time it gets better. And when I do things like data analysis of what the learning gains were in that course, they are slowly going up every year, but they are going up. And thankfully, there's a lot of great colleagues here, with the Division of Teaching Excellence and Innovation, and in the School of Physical Sciences, we have some incredible professors of teaching who do absolutely fantastic work in this area, who've been able to be just a huge, huge help in pedagogical development.
Thanks. All right, so are there any questions? If you raise your hand, wait till the microphone comes so the people on Zoom can hear your question as well.
Thank you. Is this on? Thank you for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
This is a big question to lay at your feet, but you may be aware of the UC Native American Opportunity Program that started this fall. That's the tuition waiver for recognized tribal members and all that. Do you think UC is ready for these students, and what can we do to make it ready for students? Because I think I know the answer, but what can we do to make it ready for students as support staff and faculty and other professionals at UCI?
Yeah, so I'm super, super happy this opportunity program exists. Unfortunately, it's not retroactive, so it can't cover my debt from before. But really, just that financial burden of having the tuition be covered is really, really huge. And in some ways, it makes a lot of sense, since the UC's initial endowment is entirely from things like the Morrill Act, which sold off tribal land in order to fund it. And so the university's success, the University of California's success, is very much already paid for by the tribes of California. And so are we ready? I think absolutely no. Aside from the limitations that Proposition 209 has, we have this issue where we've put a significant portion of the nation's American Indian population in very rural, hard to reach areas. And so one recruiter now is tasked with a small number of students spread out across the state. And unfortunately, a lot of incentives are based on how many students you reach. So by definition, why even bother? Because your own incentives are against helping this population. There's no way you can reach a large number of students and cover the entire state of California. And so despite this, everyone I know who's in this Native American recruiting position does really, really fantastic work trying to make this work with their between 25 and 50% appointments to try to do this. We have one person at UCI who does fantastic work trying to reach out in this area. And that's just for recruitment. Once we get students in, what do they do when we get here? And this is the part where, for UCI, we actually used to lead this space a bit about a decade or more ago, where there was powwows on campus, there was space on campus, there was staff and personnel, and we have none of that now. All of that's kind of gone away as budgets have crept up and different scenarios have happened. And that's kind of sad. So we are not in a great position at UCI. There are some institutions, for instance, UC Riverside and UCLA, where they do have space. They have tribal advisors who can consult the chancellor. They work closely with the tribes that are nearby. They have space, they have staff, and they're able to do a little bit better. Is it enough for what's going to happen in the next few years? Is potentially many more students enroll? That remains to be seen. My guess is having some support there will help a lot, but it's really going to be different because it's such a diverse group of students. We have a Native American boarding school over in Riverside that has students that come in, and they're going to have a very different experience than someone who is an American Indian growing up in LA, and they're going to have a different experience than an American Indian who grew up in Hoopa. And so just from a couple California students alone, wildly different experiences. They're going to have a wildly different transition issue trying to come in here. And do we provide the services or even let people know that there are services, we're going to have to see in the next few years what needs to be done.
There was a question back here.
Hi, thanks so much for coming and sharing your story. It was really revealing as far as, you know, what you went through growing up and how you got to this point. That's great. You might have already answered it, but I was wondering, is there any club or organization on campus for Native American students at this point, at this time?
So yes, the ongoing organization has been the American Indian Student Council, and they are in the process of getting officers and forming a group now. And my understanding is that there's around 13 students interested, which is way, way more than anything we've had since I started here. What kind of ends up happening is when there is a couple students that are involved, if there's only 3 or 4 students, they have to take on the work group of everyone, and there is no staff support. So they have to organize all the meetings and do everything they can, and they end up just burnt out. And so anyone who's not in the group sees these students who end up taking on way too much and struggling, and they kind of stay away, and it really just makes the group in this constant cycle of trying to get something together and fizzling out and going back and forth. And that's been what's kind of happened over the past few years. But my hope is we actually have a lot of great support with some of the new leadership in the Cross-Cultural Center. And they've been really working hard to work with some of the students that are there, getting them space renovated, getting them an office so that they have a place to go ahead and meet and have a home on campus. And so my hope is that this ends up evolving into a place where students can go. But it remains to be seen. I mean, without having someone who can kind of look across our students and find the ones that, you know, would benefit from an experience like this, I don't know if anyone can do that in like a 10% appointment or something. But what I can say is that everyone who's involved is working really, really hard to try to make that a possibility.
So very inspiring. I heard your talk in front of the Optical Society last month. So
Oh, yes.
Your physics research, but so that's my question actually. Your science teacher, I noticed, was more of a biology teacher. How did you end up choosing physics as kind of your first passion and interest and going to study physics at Berkeley?
It was so I applied to all of the UCs. It had one application that allowed you to do that, that was the benefit for me. I also applied to the CSUs as well. And I didn't really know what any of these majors were. So for most of the schools, I had friends who were picking things like mechanical engineering, and I'm like, I know what a mechanic is. That sounds great. So that's what I applied to for most of the schools. But then when I was looking at the 2 schools that offered this degree called engineering physics, which were Berkeley and San Diego at the time, I was like, that sounds cool. I don't know what that is. I'll check that box. That is literally the process. And I thought that because I had taken this AP physics thing, it might work out. That was literally the only part of it. And yeah, it really is just kind of like that absurd stroke of luck that put me on the path today.
So we'll do one more question.
Back here, Franklin.
I've never really used this, so hi. So I'm a student services advisor in the School of Engineering, working mostly with grad students, a little bit with undergrads, and I'm personally a first-gen college student. However, my background is more psychology and American Indian Studies. So my question to you is kind of selfish. As a STEM, someone who went through this like a STEM program, what would you have wanted if you were to walk into, say, my office as a STEM major, either grad student or undergrad? What kind of, basically, would you have wanted someone like me to help you with?
Yeah, so I think it depends on which stage of, because walking into this institution for the first time, like your entire, especially first gen, like I really had no idea what to expect. I saw the registry, I knew that I signed up for classes and everyone takes about the same classes when they first come in. But you think that's all that matters are these classes. And when you do bad in a class, you think it's over and that's it and whatever. And so, you know, but at the end of the day, there's a purpose for the degree program, and that's to go off and lead a career somewhere. That part I absolutely did not understand or appreciate coming through the door. And just knowing that, like, once you leave here, the world is not like what's happening in these classes, right? My example of the physics lab, and I hate that that's how we do physics labs, because it gives the impression that that's what a physicist does. And it's absolutely not what a physicist does. If we look at what physicists do, they try things, it doesn't work, they try different things, and they use this foundation of math and physics to try to solve a problem with. And I had no intuition of any of that based on my early academic career there. And I didn't know who to talk to about that, and I didn't know I should talk to people about that. So I'd say that a really big part of it, and the thing that kind of organically started forming for me, was having just strong mentorship, both in peer mentorship from people who are maybe 1 or 2 years above me, talking about, no, you're going to want to take a class like this because it'll be important for that. No, you should consider this school, farther along in the career path, who kind of have an idea of how things might work, as well as people who have made it out there already, who have jobs, and why that's important. Someone who I didn't mention is a colleague, Jeremy Hamilton. He was an early career scientist who was working at the time when I met him at IBM at the Almaden Research Center. And I met him through an event at the American Indian Science and Engineering Society. And he had just graduated with a degree in engineering physics from the University of Oklahoma, and had a lot of experiences that I did. And I could really relate to that. And I saw how he was able to go get a job and actually make a good living for himself, and just have give me something where I could see a direction I could go into in a few years. And before I had met him, I had no idea where I'd end up.
Great. So I think in the interest of time, we'll sort of stop here, but join me in thanking Franklin again for a wonderful talk.